Photosynthesis is another series of chemical reactions and what you're probably used to thinking about photosynthesis is that it's how plants make food. Except we're going to go ahead and put food in quotation marks, because really what the plant is trying to do is it's trying to create a monomer. That's the goal. We want a monomer that can be used for a lot of different functions. And in plants, the main monomer that they're going to use is a basic carbohydrate. Really a monosaccharide. Because plants are going to use this to build starch, to build cellulose. Really, a plant is built of carbohydrates. And so the equation that you're commonly used to seeing is CO2 plus H2O plus sunlight creates C6, there's our carb, H12O6, plus O2. The convenient thing is that photosynthesis and respiration are really opposites of each other in terms of reactants and products. We can balance this equation by adding the coefficient of 6. And then we have a balanced equation. And we focus on that this is the desired product. And O2 will actually be waste that will be released by the plant. So when we look at the basic idea of photosynthesis, we're going to get light energy from the environment, carbon dioxide gas from the environment. This is entering mostly through the leaves. We're going to get water from the environment, entering mostly through the roots. That's one of the reasons we talked about active transport in the root, being able to move water into the roots at a really high rate. It shows oxygen being released as a waste. It does not show what's happening to the sugar. And that's because the sugar is really being incorporated into the plant's body. Some plants, when you eat them, are sweet. And so we can see the glucose. But other plants are not sweet. Or if you eat lettuce, not sweet. And that's because the basic sugar has been stored as either starch in a potato or a carrot, or as cellulose, which is going to make up the main body of the plant cell, that cell wall. So when we look at photosynthesis, the main thing we need to understand is that we're actually taking light energy and we're converting it into chemical energy. Right? That sugar is the chemical energy. So for a plant, it's being able to take inorganic compounds, store the light energy in the bonds of the organic molecule. So the plant is really taking energy from the sun and storing it in a different form that it can come back to later. So what we're going to start with is we need to talk a little bit about what is this light energy. So if you look at the sun, which is just a big star, which is just a ball of gas that's actually breaking down, the sun is going to emit a whole what we call spectrum of energy. Right? So this is actually called the electromagnetic spectrum, and it's looking at the energy that's coming from the sun. When we think of energy coming from the sun, a lot of times we think of light that we can see and heat. So infrared is actually heat. If we look at the entire electromagnetic spectrum, we see that energy comes in lots of different forms. And we see that we are actually going to have different amounts of energy depending on the wavelength. So when we have a shorter wavelength, like down here at the gamma rays, we're more like this. And then what we see is that the wavelength gets longer, the distance between the wave gets longer. So this is how energy moves. So this is a lot of times considered electricity or energy can be seen in a wave formation or a photon, an individual unit formation. So we do understand that this energy that's coming from the sun comes in different forms. Really high energy and really low energy forms. And we're really only able, our eyes are only able to perceive visible light, which is a very small amount of the electromagnetic spectrum. When we look at visible light, the white light, can actually be, and you can do this with a prism, it can actually be separated into distinct units or a smaller spectrum. And again, what we have to pay attention to here is the wavelength and therefore the amount of energy. So the shorter the wavelength, like 380 nanometers, is smaller than 750. But the shorter the wavelength, the more energy there actually is in each unit. The reason this is going to be important is that when we get light energy from the sun, and this is the visible light, so there's all sorts of energy from the sun. When we get the visible white light, that visible light is actually broken down into different wavelengths. And that's where Roy G. Biv comes from. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. And so I kind of wish this were turned around because we all remember it, Roy G. Biv. But what we'll have to do is just remember that red and violet. Here's how I remember which one is which. Ultraviolet is really high energy. So we're not going to need to know gamma, X, UV, micro, radio. We need to understand the visible light spectrum because that's the energy plants are going to take advantage of. And we have to know which one of these is higher energy. So ultraviolet is higher energy. So if you can remember ultraviolet is next to violet, then you'll remember that violet is higher energy than red. Infrared is past the red. And so I kind of think of far red, and this is lower energy. So there's actually more energy in the lower wavelengths. This is going to be important because different plants will be able to use different parts of this spectrum. So plants use a variety of wavelengths. The other thing that we have to be aware of is when we can see something, it's actually being reflected. So the color that appears to our eyes is being reflected, not absorbed. And plants are all about absorbing this light. So if something is being reflected or not absorbed, that means that the plant cannot use that wavelength. So when you look out at a plant, we are used to seeing them be green. And that's because most plants cannot absorb that color light. And so the reason that plants appear green is because they are reflecting that colored light. When you see plants of different colors, like a plant that has purple, that means that it's using the blue, indigo, orange, yellow, violet. Red, it's reflecting the violet. So we do have to keep in mind, light comes in all these different wavelengths. These wavelengths appear to us as visible light. Plants are able to use visible light, but they're only able to use certain parts of the spectrum. So let's look at how do plants actually absorb light. Plants are going to have pigments. So a pigment is a protein that can absorb light. A pigment is a protein that absorbs light. And really, what it's absorbing is light energy. So, in a plant is a chloroplast. Now, you have to be careful because not every plant cell will have a chloroplast. Only plant cells that are able to absorb light. So if it's a part of the plant that isn't being given light, like the roots or the center of the stem, it's not going to have a chloroplast. It's not going to have these pigments. So what we have to be aware of is we're in the chloroplast, and embedded in the thylakoid membrane is a cluster of pigment molecules. And we actually do want to also pay attention to the fact that it is a cluster. So many pigment molecules. These pigment molecules are capable of absorbing light. So we're inside of a phospholipid bilayer, so we have a hydrocarbon tail. And that allows the protein to embed in the thylakoid membrane. And this part up here is going to absorb light. The primary pigment in plants is going to be chlorophyll. That is the primary pigment that is going to be able to absorb light. It actually comes in two forms, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. But we also have what are called accessory pigments. And accessory pigments are going to be able to absorb light energy and transfer to chlorophyll. And so what we see is that when we look at the different wavelengths, we can see how much is absorbed by what. And so what we see is that we have some pigments that can absorb the purples and the blues, some that can absorb the reds and the yellows, but when we look right at green, there's really not a lot that's going to be able to absorb right at green. So green is kind of empty, I guess we could use, or it's almost always reflected. So we have pigments that are able to absorb in the blues, the greens, the yellows, seeing where the violets start here. This is actually ultraviolet and infrared. But our violet, blue, yellow, and red, we've got a lot of coverage. We're really able to absorb that light. And so we're in the chloroplast, we've absorbed the light. What do we do with the light? And so what we're going to see is we're going to use that light to excite electrons. Excite electrons. And so we're actually going to see another electron transport chain. We're going to see that we're going to excite the electron and pass it to an electron carrier. A slightly different version of an electron carrier here, but we're still going to be transferring the electrons. The source of the electron is actually going to be water. So we're going to split water, take the electron and excite it, and pass it to an electron carrier. So we'll get a little bit deeper into exactly how this happens, but the main idea is that plants are able to absorb light and excite electrons.